Okay.
Hello, Global Theater. My name is Jerry Fielka. It's April 16, 2024. We want to thank Rob Grant and his amazing podcast, I'm Probably Wrong About Everything. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here back with Johanna Drucker for part two. Thank you, Johanna. Where are you calling in from?
Mar Vista on the west side of Los Angeles.
How cool is that? So we talked a lot about many things in part one, and I wanted to start with what is the function of poetry? Basics and get into concrete poetry. So just off the top of your head, what's the function of poetry?
It's such a great question because I think people take poetry for granted as a form that is mostly sort of foreign to them. It's like, but
Yep.
yeah, I mean, it's like, you ask somebody to read something and they will, and you say it's not poetry, it's like, it's very, which didn't used to be the case, of course, in many cultures. Poetry was one of the first forms of literary expression. It came with dance and it came with music and it came with song and chanting and ritual practices. But I think in the 21st century, it's sort of, it's like, oh, that might be something I don't understand. And but I think the fundamental function of poetry is to call attention to language.
Yeah.
And then what does it do? Like, how does language work? And then the range of poetic expressions, of course, is broad and, multifaceted. There's people who are really dedicated to the lyric voice, individual in inner life and experience and expression. But in my generation, I, started to be involved with the literary world in the 1970s. The focus really was much more on the material of poetry and its workings, on the material of language and its workings as a social form, historical form, graphical form. So, you see this in language poetry in the 1970s, but there's the long history of concrete poetry. But then
Well, when did that start, Joanna? I mean, when did the label come about, concrete poetry? And just give us a basic.
sure,
What are you saying is language poetry and what is concrete poetry? Is there a
sure.
difference? Yeah.
Yeah. Language poetry was an intellectual movement that was concerned with really sort of, again, attending to the formal and qualities of language and material qualities of language, but not as a visual form. And so it's much more as a social form. A lot of influence from Russian formalism, the work of Victor Shklovsky and others who, just were attentive to the way that these were people who crossed over from the field that we call linguistics, which is the study of language. And in their crossover, they were interested in syntax, which is the sort of structure of language, and semantics, which is the meaning function of language. But concrete poetry has a very specific meaning when it's attached to the sort of 1960s articulations by the German and Argentine poets who were, and Brazilian poets who were part of this Neugandres group. And they wrote a pilot program for concrete poetry. And by concrete, what they meant was something really specific, which was, could you make the meaning of the word and the way it looked so tightly bound together that there was no room for misinterpretation or even, sort of wide ranging sort of different readings. So one of the canonical famous poems in this genre is a poem by Eugen Gamringer, and it's called Silencio, or Silence. And it's a grid, 3x3 grid that says silence, 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 and then starts down the next column, silence, leaves a gap, and then the word silence, and then 3 silences across the bottom. So the concept of silence, the representation of silence, the appearance of silence, and the statement of silence are all really tightly bound together. And it's, there's similar things in the visual art movement with minimalism and the work of somebody like Donald Judd, who, writes a very important essay called Specific Objects. And Judd, it's almost funny. I mean, not, you know, in a derisive sense, but funny. He says, I don't want anything decorative. I don't want anything beautiful. I don't want anything that has to do with composition. I don't want and
Yeah.
so there was a kind of distillation in this period of the 1960s to what felt like the fundamental components of aesthetic practice, whether it was poetry, music. I mean, think about John Cage, 4 minutes and 33 seconds, right? You're just gonna listen to whatever, to the ambient sound. So that kind of focus and distillation cut across aesthetic movements in Western, you know, in Western culture.
Yeah.
And
Beautiful. What so well summarized. Just a couple little quickie things you evoked, you know. Thelonious Monk, jazz pianist, said silence is the loudest sound in the universe.
yeah,
And I love this whole delve into John Cage's 433. I mean, that song charted on the English pop charts in the last 20 years. That's like funny. And it's just like how we want to think poetry got back into being like hip and nice to do, like with slam poetry. So,
right.
you know, all the beyond broke highbrow poets are like, you don't memorize your poem and perform it, you read it. So, you know, there's all this thing I love. I'm going to get to it. But the one thing, a friend of mine who framed art in Venice for a long time with a lot of these great artists, told me his theory of Duchamp, and it reminded me of the example you gave of concrete poetry silence. The silence piece is, he said, the way Duchamp might have invented, you know, conceptual art was if you go into an art gallery and there's a painting there, and then you move and there's another painting, and then there's a blank space and it might say on loan to the Cleveland Art Museum, and then there's another painting. And he said that missing painting is that missing space in the gallery is what I'm calling conceptual art. It's the context, it's the environment of the gallery or the museum that enables you to create conceptual art. And then he went on, and then he went on to say, in the future, the artist will only have to point. So I'm always like, see that cigarette butt on the floor? That's my art. But I'm wondering, I'm wondering your specific moment when you're growing up, studying language, knowing writing, literature, and you go, oh, where's your tipping point? You go, I'm going to try concrete poetry. And why'd you do it? What was that, changeover for you?
Well, you know, I mean, I have a little apocryphal tale I like to tell, which is that when I was 6 years old, my parents took us on a trip to Europe. And, you know, this was amazing. I mean, because my parents didn't come from any kind of background. They'd never been abroad. This was, you know, and it was 1958, imagine. And, you know, so taking a little American family to Europe in this period and driving around was crazy. But we went to this place called Europe, and I had a lot of trouble understanding how Europe related to France, Italy, Switzerland. Like, here's this thing, we're going to Europe, but we never are in Europe. We're always in France or Italy or Switzerland or something. So, but we start in Great Britain, and then we go to these countries in Europe, and then we go to Israel and back. So to me, this was 5 big chunks, right? The UK, France, Switzerland, Italy, Israel. So I came back and I said, thank God my parents finally gave me something to write about. I'm like this little, 6-year-old pain in the butt, right?
Yeah.
And I then sat down and wrote in my, little mind, a 5-part essay for the school paper, the Chatterbox, that was organized in chunks that matched the 5 chunks of the trip.
Oh, there you go. So you were doing concrete poetry before you knew that it was a genre.
Yeah.
That is,
it's very funny. And then we didn't really know what concrete poetry was. I mean, visual poetry, of course, has a very long history and goes back into antiquity with shaped poems and so forth. But you didn't get exposed to that very much in school. But there's a couple of examples that are very graphic that most school kids knew. And one was The Tale of the Mouse in Alice in Wonderland.
Yeah.
right? And another, when we were, kids was, not kids, but, young, still in school, elementary or junior high, was, E. E. Cummings, The
Yeah.
Grasshopper. Right?
Yes.
Like,
Wow.
"Oh, grasshopper. Wow, what is that? That's so cool." All the letters are spread out, and why is it doing that? And so these were sort of like little hints and glimmers that there were other things. And then, you find Apollinaire and you read Il pleut, it's raining, and you see, oh, the letters are running down the page. So little by little, you start to see these things.
Beautiful. Johanna, I wanted to go into music and the crossover just for a second because my friend says the three T's of music are technique, theory, and taste. So, technique, you learn how to do it. Theory, you know what's the structure. How does one acquire taste? And this is, just staying on to poetry. In poetry, how did you gravitate towards E. Cummins and Alice in Wonderland and not the other things? How does one acquire taste?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, to me, my education was just through reading and through peers and
Yeah.
exposure. And it's like in for me in high school, my French teacher opened the door to the world of Baudelaire and Rimbaud and then Mallarmé. And this was conceptual, theoretical, kind of wonderful stuff. We were far from the kind of standard sonnets of or even Alexandrines of, Lamartine and stuff. So modern poetry was introduced to me mainly in my French class. And then, I think taste is no different in the arts than it is in food. If you never have the chance to taste, camembert or brie or gorgonzola, you think that, craft singles are just fine. And, so it's, right. So then you're like, oh, and at first you're like, ooh, yuck. And I think there's a lot of that with, when you're exposed to unfamiliar literature. It's like,
Yeah.
really? Yuck. You know? Cinema.
You're using my kind of language like yuck. Like I one of my favorite words I grew up with is nuh-uh. Like, who invented nuh-uh? But let's stay on this word taste for a second. McLuhan said that song is slowed down speech. The reason cultures have different musical taste is ultimately connected to language difference. So I mean, what's your take on that? Any thoughts or what does it prompt?
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing to think about. I mean, cultural difference, so many factors play a role. Dress, dance, opportunity, influence, what you're exposed to. I mean, when we think about the world music movement, which was really getting going in Berkeley when I was there in the 70s,
Yeah.
it was possible to hear music you had never heard before and to think about how it might, be part of your own repertoire.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We were hearing the Israelites by Desmond Decker on AM radio, because we're the same age, on AM radio. We didn't know that was reggae. We just thought that was another type of music. We were hearing opera from Mighty Mouse.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we were hearing exactly your area, what you're saying from the Bay Area. We heard gospel music. It was called "Oh Happy Day" by Edwin Hopkins.
Yeah.
We didn't go, well, that's gospel music.
Yeah.
We were going, that's pop music. It's coming out of my AM transistor radio.
Exactly, right. Motown, I mean, it was just, you knew there was a Detroit sound, and I grew up in Philly, so we knew there were Philly bands and
Yes.
kinds of things. But, so yeah, but I think, the processes of cultural influence and transmission and exchange, I think they're really interesting. You can track them just like you track, exchanges on the Silk Road and networks of influence. So, Yeah, it's really, I mean, the specialization of different languages in different pockets of human population is so fascinating. You know, it's like what were people how were people communicating in these various waves of migration coming out of Africa? Like, we now know there wasn't a single migration. There were multiple waves. People went out, they went back in, they got isolated. There were, independent sort of, cultural growth developments and so forth. So at what point do, these, hominid, human, Homo sapiens start to develop languages? How local are they? There's no social media to standardize language, a million years ago. And yet language is the fundamental social media. It's like, right?
Well, what's more fundamental, music or language?
If we look at animal species and the species that are kind of come up close to, that have fairly sophisticated, capacities for vocalization, they do both, right? There's whale song, and there's all kinds of sounds and body language gestures that are codified in primate populations and so forth. So I'm not sure there's such a big separation
Yeah,
between song and speech. I think that differentiation comes more with cultural practices.
yeah. And I'm curious, staying on this sort of parallel between music and poetry. Leonard Cohen said, the only way you can sell a concert is to put yourself at risk. And if you don't do that, people know.
Hmm.
What role does risk play in your creative process, say when you're writing a concrete poem or doing your art?
Yeah, well, I think, every time you make something, it's a gamble. And I think, for Cohen, that meant an ethical gamble as well, right? It's like, if you're not all in with it, what are you doing? And, if you don't have that level of commitment to sort of take yourself to, the kind of furthest place you can go, then, what are you doing?
Yeah.
So, but, then there's work that you do for amusement as well, kind of keep yourself. I mean, I like to set myself a problem. Like, I recently did a studio visit with a younger artist, and they were doing interesting stuff. I mean, in material terms, playing with this and playing with that. But the question I wanted to ask them is, what's the problem you're setting yourself? What are you
Yeah.
trying to find out? What are you trying to, what are the intellectual parameters of your project?
Yeah.
And so much art does not so many artists and poets don't ask themselves that question. They're writing because they say, I'm a poet, so they write. And there's a kind of, I don't know, it doesn't result necessarily in very interesting work if there isn't that kind of intellectual rigor, I think. But
It's really a good point. I love the it sounds like a cop out in how people sometimes diss Duchamp, but for me, he really spoke to me, and he
oh yeah,
said, there's no solution because there's no problem. Now
well,
that sounds mamby-pamby and Pollyanna, which is how I am sometimes. But I'm curious your take on that in regards to this. You're saying, hey, young artist, what's your problem here? And you're like, well, they could just go, well, Duchamp said there's no solution because there is no problem.
right,
So
yeah.
how would you, talk
I
about that?
think that's a little bit of kind of dodging on Duchamp's part, because if anybody formulated conceptual parameters for their work, it was Duchamp. Look, he put forth an entire self-reflexive critique of the assumptions on which art is established as art.
Yeah.
So, I mean, come on, that is is it naming? Is it pointing? Is it signing? Is it
Yeah.
exhibiting? So he really, did all of that. So I think that, I understand what he was saying because he didn't want to see things in kind of mechanistic terms.
Yeah.
We're not engineers. We're not solving a problem when we make art, but we are conceptualizing a project that I think has to move you from one place to another.
That's good. It also, just the word dodging reminds me of W.C. Fields was reading the Bible, and they go, dude, why are you reading the Bible? He goes, I'm looking for loopholes.
I think he's not the only one.
Yeah, that's why I read Finnegan's Wake. I'm looking for loopholes.
I thought you were looking for wormholes.
Yeah, wormholes. There you go. There's the new wording, wormholes. I gotta give you big credit on that one. The other day at the Beat event, I made a verbal blooper, and I said 7 Dudley Animal instead of 7 Dudley Avenue. And it was like, whoa, that could be the name of our documentary, 7 Dudley Animal.
Right.
Instead of loopholes. That's brilliant. Thank you for that. And so, Viola Spolin was an amazing woman. She was a social worker in Chicago, and she was using role-playing exercises and kind of invented comedy improv. So Second City and Saturday Night Live all sort of spawned from her teachings. And here's a line she says: if the audience cannot see your struggle to achieve something, they cannot root for you to achieve it. So, what role does struggle play in your creative process?
There's struggle at so many different levels, right? There's the struggle at the kind of compositional level. First, there's a conceptual level, like, what am I doing? Then the compositional level of the moment to moment kind of work. I think there's the existential struggle of, like, is this for anybody, for anything? What's it worth?
Yeah.
I think there's the social struggle. I mean, we could cut it a lot of different ways. But on the other hand, there's also, just the sheer virtuosity of someone who makes something look easy.
Yeah.
And, boy, you might not have to root for them, but it is spectacular, to see. It's just amazing.
You mean it makes it look easy. So let me suss that out and see if this is what you mean. Like someone looks at this guy went backstage at a Sun Ra concert once, and he went up to Sun Ra and says, my kid could play that. And Sun Ra said, yeah, but can he transcribe it? and kids, people look at Jackson Pollock and go, hey, look I could do that splash art. And I think, in my opinion, is that great art is when you go, hey, I could do that. And then it really messes you up. You're like, what the heck is this? I mean, it sort of shakes you up. So, I mean,
well, the thing is,
what I'm trying to ask is, when you said make it look easy, you mean that to the viewer or the consumer of the art, they go, oh, it seems as though it was easy for you to create that. Like, just suss out what you make it look easy. Yeah.
Well, again, it's after the fact of Jackson Pollock. Somebody can walk into a gallery and say, my kid could do that.
Yeah.
But could they think it? Could they come up with it?
Yeah.
Could they actually understand why it is a significant move within the world of visual art to do that?
Yeah.
And so that's a huge difference. But again, you think about, just sheer virtuosity of technique and skill. And, if you listen to Yo-Yo Ma, it's like, you don't have to root for Yo-Yo Ma, right? You're just kind of in awe, right? You sit there and go, how can that even happen? How can a human being do that, right?
Yeah. That being in awe is a good thing. And I love that you're saying yeah, but who came up with this? Like,
Yeah,
so many people think, oh, Cage, silent piece is bullshit. It's like, well, but did you think it up? Like to sit,
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah.
So Mike Kelly said, making art is making your problems other people's problems. Any reaction to that line?
Oh, I wish him luck.
And then Fanny Howe, the poet, said, the point of art is to show people that life is worth living by showing that it isn't.
Yeah, again, I mean, I wish her luck.
Yeah,
I mean, to me, the point of luck is the point of art is to call attention
yeah.
to things and to call attention through making, call attention through framing. And, that's, Charles Bernstein has a wonderful little snippet of verse where he says, it's in a poem he wrote called Clupsy Girl. And it is poetry is like a swoon, but with this difference, it calls you to attention. Isn't
Wow.
that nice?
That's
So,
beautiful.
yeah. So to me, it's not so much about life or death or, it's about what I love about aesthetic experience is that it, shows you what you are not paying attention to. It opens up your, it's good old Aldous Huxley and William Blake opening the doors to perception.
What you are not paying attention to, that is so important. How do we figure out what we're not paying attention
Yeah.
to? Yeah, that's like uh, Gregory Bates and my friend was teaching me, pay no attention that I'm lying to you. And so T.S. Eliot said poetry is outing your inner dialogue. What language is your inner dialogue in?
Yeah. Well, again, Eliot is very much, within that lyric tradition. So for him, that, sort of giving voice to that interior voice, even with its historical and social dimensions, was what drove him. I make work because I want to see what it will be.
Yeah.
It's like I have an idea and I want to see what it's going to be. And so I sit down and work to give form to thought. And,
Yeah.
so that to me, that's, so I'm a more intellectual poet than Eliot.
Yeah. To give form to thought. That is good
That
because
damn lightweight. Old
say it
Tom.
again.
That darn lightweight old Tom.
Oh, Tom, that's lightweight.
Intellectual poet. I'm not some lyric poet.
Yeah. Abigail Child's great experimental filmmaker. I says, what form is your inner or I said, what language is your inner dialogue in? And she goes, I wish I knew. I sort of love that because a lot of people go, well, English. And I go, well, metaphorically, I'm really asking what form is your
Yeah.
inner consciousness in?
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know,
Well, and again, it's, I know Abby and I know her work and I've known her for a long time. And, again, I think that she is, as I am, somebody who also thinks visually.
yeah,
So you can't edit films or shoot films the way she does unless the visual is a kind of primary mode. She's not translating language into images. She is, making work through a visual, sort of stream of production. Now there may be a linguistic gloss. She's very articulate. She's a poet as well as a filmmaker. She could talk about what she's done, but it's when I make a visual work, it's not a language act. It's a graphic expression that comes directly.
yeah. Well, two of my film heroes have this mantra. George Manupelli says, ignore yourself. Jonas Mika says, there is no self-expression. And Cecil Taylor, the great jazz pianist, says, I'm just a vehicle and this stuff just comes through me.
Yeah.
Is art making more self-expression or more you're a vehicle for whatever technologies, environments, and cultures are dominant?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I really think we should stop having, courses in creative writing and self-expression. We really ought to teach people self-repression.
Yeah.
So, much more useful.
Yeah.
But again, I'm born in a generation that comes of age with Roland Barthes, The Death of the Author,
Yeah.
and so I see myself as a social subject, produced in and through the conditions of my existence, and yet, in spite of that, we each have individual fingerprints. We each have a voice. We each have, we're each differentiated and specific. So. Yeah, it's so we channel and we introduce the swerve, good old Lucretius. It's that differentiating swerve that makes us each, other than the rest.
True wordsmithery. That was beautiful. And so thank you, Johanna. This is fun because the real hidden question in that one was, can art making be egoless?
Well, I mean, again, I think has to do with the way that a practice is conceived. Certainly, I think people are, serious about, kind of following a Buddhist path, have a kind of capacity for that. There's been a couple yeah, but it's yeah. I don't. Most of my work is not about myself. I speak from a position, but I'm not that interested in writing about myself.
Yeah.
There's a real difference between those two things. I mean, that said, I've written a bunch of autobiographical stuff, and sometimes it's all autobiography. This is one of those things where when I was teaching drawing, it became so clear. It's like you ask students to, draw anything you want, right? Just draw anything you want. You get the worst cliches. Everybody draws a barking dog, a tree with, very elaborate bark, and one or two other things, a superhero, whatever. It's cliche after cliche. But you give them an assignment. Okay, go home. You've got to draw a coat, a desk, and a chair in some arrangement with each other. So they don't think it's about them at all. They think it's about the coat, the desk, and the chair. And they come back. And Jerry, these drawings reveal so much about the psychology, the family, family of origin, the fears. It's like this little tiny shriveled coat next to a giant desk, or something. And you realize, it's like where things become interesting in terms of self-expression is when you don't ask people to talk about themselves, but you ask them to do an exercise that appears neutral. And boy, then you get everything.
That is amazing because a friend told me James Benning tells his experimental filmmaking students at CalArts, go sit in the waiting room of a police station. Yeah. It's like, what? No, just go sit there and observe. So that is this conundrum, because some creative writing teachers say, write what you know. And then others say, no, make it up. Use your imagination. And Einstein said the great line, well, I don't know if it's great, but imagination is more important than knowledge. So what's this? What is this deal? Write what you know or make shit up? I mean,
well, and again, I think, push yourself into something that you don't know and learn about it. I mean, I think that's what the go sit in the police station is about. Force yourself to have an encounter with the world or with some material that you're unfamiliar with.
Yeah.
And, then you learn something. You have to work something out in the course of doing the project. It
reminds me of McLuhan's line, carefully make plans, then do the opposite.
Well, I like Buckminster Fuller, right? If you're having trouble, sort of with insight and understanding, put a cinder in your eye.
Oh, nice.
It's like you disrupt the normative function and suddenly it's like, oh my God, right? There's all these things you take for granted.
I know. One of the great moments in part one with you was, what new tool do you suggest? And you said something like subversion, or I forgot the word, but it was just like, what? It's like, what? But that's just exactly what we need. But here is Milan Kundera in Unbearable Likeness of Being. This is why I love writing, because the character that I'm writing about can go further than I can. Could you, any thoughts on that line?
Well, again, I'm not sure exactly what he means by that, but certainly it's fun, as a writer to inhabit the consciousness of someone other, and then to sort of put them in situations where they succeed, they, do amazing things. I've just been working on a novel about a 19th century figure. She's made up, but she's based on many other people. And she, as a child, discovers she has certain psychic abilities. And, it's like, so do I have psychic abilities? I have a set of hypersensitivity, but I'm not psychic. And so for me to imagine this character and how her life unfolds, because this is thrust on her, she's not seeking it. Right?
Yeah.
She can go to the Berkeley Psychic Institute and learn to read chakras.
Good.
She just can tell what someone's about to say.
Yeah.
And she doesn't know why, she just can. So as a writer, I had great fun, sort of creating a world for her and a career for her and a life for her. So in that sense, yeah, it went places I could never go.
Exactly. That was good example. Is perception reality?
I'm a constructivist. So, and I've just been through a bout of a reading group where the concept of constructivist epistemology just was utterly baffling to the group. Because, again, what Jakob von Uexküll, who was one of the sort of originators of constructivist epistemology, was, said it's, we have capacities to interact with the empirical material world, and we make a representation of that is, the world we inhabit. So we inhabit the world we can construct. Perception is part of that, but we don't have an unmediated relationship with the world. And so it's unmediated. Yeah.
McLuhan probed Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce by saying, artists dream awake. And it's not to sound elitist. Everyone creates these amazing scenarios in the middle of the night, but artists can also do it while they're awake. They dream awake. Have dreams played a role in your creative process?
Yeah, not directly. I mean, at one point I kept a dream journal because I had a mentor who's been very committed to that as a practice for herself and found it useful as a way to generate material. But it's not, once in a long while when something happens in a dream. I had a very disturbing dream about 2 years ago in which my brother, who's been dead now for 10 years, came to me. And it really was something very upsetting about it. And so the next day I sat and painted the image of him as he had come to me in the dream, just to sit with it, just to be with it, to hold on to it.
Why is it so difficult for humans to consider the possibility that life may be pointless?
Yeah. Well, there it is. I wonder how much of that is imposed by the structures of religion, and how much people can be freed from that concept.
Yeah.
It's, my cats don't worry about that. They're, present in the moment. And, so again, I think much of Eastern religion is about getting away from that. Much of Western religion seems to be about keeping the account books, so that you have to pay up at the end. It's like, what?
Well, Utah Phillips says anarchy is making rules for yourself and not other people. Who's entitled to make the rules?
Well, it depends on whether you're talking about social situations, the social concept of the social contract, which was, an 18th century notion that we needed in some way to have the capacity to govern ourselves with, rules if we weren't going to rely on absolute monarchs. Or if you're talking about yourself, isn't it a daily struggle? It's like, oh, I'm allowed to do this. No, you're not allowed to do that. No, you can't have that. Yes, you can have that. I mean, it's just
That's good, Johanna, because I always bring up Zappa's great question. He didn't tell us. He just asked us, who are the brain police? Is it yourself, or is it some, consumer capitalist culture? So it's funny because when you go to the etymology on the word freedom, it says giving oneself one's own laws. And T.S. Eliot said freedom is only truly free excuse me, freedom is only truly freedom when it appears against the background of an artificial limitation, which caused McLuhan to say, how are we to argue with people who insist on sticking their heads in the invisible teeth of technology, calling the whole thing freedom? So, I mean, it's a lot of prompts again, but what the basic question is, what does freedom mean to you now?
well, it's a funny thing because I retired last year, and the task lists are endless, endless, endless. But again, that's because I enjoy it and it gives me a sense of, sort of purpose, but it's a kind of a guide to what I, want to do. But, uh, I do have a friend who is always saying to me, you need to learn to float. You need
Yeah.
to learn to just float, not have an agenda, not have a, checklist and all that. And, you know, I'm not that interested in it. I am to some extent, but to me, freedom is that now I get up and I'm able to think every day. I'm able to take up issues that I want to work on and think about, and it's great fun. Um,
Beautiful. You brought up my favorite word, fun. And it's
yeah.
how's this one? I love to make lists and go, okay, well, this is what I'm supposed to do today. And over the last half a year, I'm sort of not even doing my list so much. But when I would make my list, I would lose the list, and then I'd make a new list for the next day. And the first thing would say, find old list.
Exactly. Well, again, the lists are a nice conversation with ourselves, and I find them very funny. I go back sometimes to the lists I made years ago, and they'll have a little statement on it like write graphic design history. Like just that, a little note.
Yeah,
Right.
just a little, right.
And then we did it, wrote graphic design history.
Beautiful. You did it. Well,
So,
that's almost leads perfectly. Lewis Carroll says, I believe as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. Have you
oh,
believed in any impossible things lately?
oof. Well, I wonder what you mean by impossible because, again, I was raised by a very imaginative father and mother, but my father, when we were little kids, he would just introduce to us the idea of multiple dimensions and other worlds and other forms of life, and he would say, well, the notion that the universe is 4.5 billion years old, and that there was one big bang that has these qualities, and so it's just we think these things because of our human limitations. And he says, but there are energy forms and forces that move through multiple universes at scales and in forms that we can't even conceive. So, when you're a little kid and that's the kind of stuff your father's telling you, it's like dessert it's like dessert for the whole meal, right? It's
Oh,
just great.
yeah. It reminds me of Sun Ra, of all places, was quoted in the New Yorker. The impossible attracts me because everything possible has been done and the world didn't change.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Tell me one major element of your creativeness that's changed and one major element that stayed the same in the years you've been doing it.
It's a good question. Hmm. What's changed? Well, honestly, what changed is my capacity to actually do the things that I wanna do. It's like, I feel like now I have that capacity. I can say I'm gonna do something and I can, and I have more you know, a greater range of expertise on which to draw, and that's a result of work. You just kinda keep working and working and working. But I don't have a problem. I never really did, but, so, yeah, I would say what's changed is just the stronger foundation for being able to carry through from conception to execution.
Yeah.
Um, but in terms of thematics or outlook, I mean, I write in so many different veins and genres, and reading through a book of mine today that I wrote in the '80s and was published in the early '90s, and wow, it was like, gosh, it has all these elements in it that are still central to my work.
Wow.
It draws on it's a kind of reportage, it draws on public discourse and language. It's about the dystopia of ongoing current events. It has these kind of citations and plays with pop culture and pulp writing and pulp novels and genre fiction, and yet it's very compressed and combinatoric. So it's like, whoa, it's like all the same in a way.
Beautiful. Isn't that cool? You can reflect that. In your first comment about what's changed reminds me of Frank Zappa saying, don't stop and keep going.
Yeah, exactly. No,
That's it.
I was saying this to a young friend this morning who's, sort of having trouble figuring out how to manage, a career and creative life. And I said, the most important thing is just to keep working. You've
That's
got to
it.
keep working.
Yeah.
And, somebody years ago it's in the late '70s, a professional artist who was a friend of a friend and, about 10 years older than I was. And just one time just said to me, the difference between people who succeed and people who don't is doing the work.
Yeah.
Because if you don't do the work, there's nothing there. That's all. It's that basic.
Yeah, it reminds me of one of my heroes. He put out the punk magazine in LA for years, Reverend Al. He says, don't sell out, sneak in.
Yes, I love it.
But I'd love to hear your reaction to this one. It's Paul Schrader, wrote Taxi Driver and makes movies. He said, the role of the artist is to attempt to sell out, but fail.
Well, unfortunately, I'm all too familiar with that because
But it doesn't
it's
it
very
come off,
funny.
most people go, oh, that's great. And it almost comes off as being a little snooty. Like my art is so pure that even when I attempted to sell out, it
Yeah,
failed, but I
yeah,
love the fact that, what is selling out is like you learn that there is a market, or
yeah,
you're like Charles Ives and you go, dude, I'm going to write my music over here and I'm going to sell insurance over here so that
yeah,
there's no relationship. So
right,
it's not
right.
a crime to sell your art. It's
Nope.
like, no. So
No, not in the least. No, I am still dreaming of becoming a successful novelist.
that is,
I am. I
if,
mean, I'm writing all the time, and
if,
I would
if
still like that to happen.
Johanna, if you don't have dreams, your dreams can't come true. That's beautiful. But here's the flip almost. Moshe Feldenkrais works with healing and movement. He says it's literally possible to identify a weakness and incorporate it to become a strength rather than we're normally taught to overcome a weakness.
Yeah.
Tell me a weakness you
Wow.
turned into a strength.
Oof. I don't know. Well, I mean, it's hard to say which things are weaknesses and liabilities, and I'm kind of I like to laugh and say, I have obsessive compulsive advantage.
Yeah, I
So,
like that.
you know, so is OCD, is being compulsive a disadvantage, a weakness, or something that you can harness?
That's like I have Lexdixia.
Yeah, exactly.
But obsessive compulsion, you've said you've turned it into a strength,
Yeah,
advantage. That's amazing. You put it in 3 words before you invented the answer in a, you're a linguist. I mean, you're a wordsmithery at the supreme. Beautiful. So fill in the blank. Anger can be a productive emotion when,
oof. I guess when it's used constructively, but yeah. I mean, we all have anger. I think we all feel slights, and we all feel, that there are things that aren't there. There's anger about what has occurred to you, and then there's anger about what is in the world, and what, the sort of, our work in the world is to try to put things right. It's a broken world, and our job is to put things right. Uh, that isn't so much my mode. I'm not, that sort of altruistic or dedicated to the service of humanity. But, I don't know.
What's the difference between rights and responsibilities?
I mean, I think rights are supposedly granted without any, sort of, sort of built in, sort of limits attached, or requirement to be somehow, accountable. But that doesn't seem correct to me. Responsibilities definitely take accountability into
Yeah.
the picture. So, I mean, I think in the current state of our society, far too many things that should be considered responsibilities have come to be perceived as rights.
How do we keep our governments from going to war?
Man, oh man, I don't know. The idea that we still have nation states that are acting like children is very terrifying, given we should know better by now, but apparently we don't. I mean, the entity of the nation state is such a complex mystery, and the idea that it has agency at that scale, you know, is I don't feel like I am, that my identity is, achieved through my relationship to the nation state. It's achieved through networks of association and connection and social, sort of patterns and relationships and so forth. But, if you ask me where my primary identity lies, I would not say it is as an X and followed by, that whatever that national identity is. Um, you
Yeah.
know,
What did they ask Gandhi? What do you think of 20th century civilization? He said, good idea.
yeah, exactly. Good idea. No, I mean, yeah, right. We should try it. It's an excellent idea.
Try it. But
Right.
here's a twist to that. John Basil Barnhill, socialist, said, where the people fear the government, you have tyranny. Where the government fears the people, you have liberty. And then the film V for Vendetta paraphrased it. People should not be afraid of their governments. Governments should be afraid of their people. So how do you personally handle false fears like the war on drugs? Well, you can't have a war on drugs because drugs don't fight, and you can't say no to drugs because drugs don't talk. But you know what I'm saying? They have the war on poverty, the war on drugs. How do you personally handle those false fears?
Yeah. Oof. Well, ideology 101 consists of several very basic principles. Number one is the more that something appears to be natural, the more it's actually cultural.
Yeah.
And then the other point, and it's the only other thing you need to know to unpack all of it, is in whose interests is it for
Yeah.
that to appear to be natural?
Yeah.
And I used to teach this all the time when I was teaching because, the term ideology seems so complicated and so fraught. You're going to have to read all these heavy critical theory books and everything. I said, no, just try to think about in whose interest is it for something to appear to simply be natural, to be the way it is. And then you start to take it apart immediately. See, I don't think government should fear their people. And I don't think people should fear their governments. The whole notion of the democratic project was that the government was of the people, by the people, and for the people. And it's not, and we can thank Citizens United for the grotesque swerve and distortion. That was a major turning point. I don't think people realized how important it was. But when, money came to be unfettered from responsibility, or accountability, it really went sour.
Yep. I asked my friend who wrote comedy with Robin Williams, can satire be destructive? He says that's the job of satire.
Exactly.
But if me or you do a cartoon in a certain country and they kill us, some people think dying is destructive. But Swift compared satire to a mirror in which people could see every face but their own. What's
I love it.
what's the function of satire?
Well, satire is a kind of acerbic form of humor, but to me, humor is the route to enlightenment.
Yeah.
You cannot, it's, I don't know if we talked about this before, but it's like, who is the greatest philosopher of the 20th century? Let's just think about this for a minute. Is it Heidegger or Monty Python?
That's pretty good.
And you go through the whole list of philosophers, okay? Like Merleau-Ponty,
Yeah.
Monty Python, right? Richard Rorty, Monty Python. I mean, Monty Python wins every time.
That's great.
Because again, it's like they knew that they knew, and they were helping you in on the joke, right? And it's just so brilliant and so insightful. So I really truly believe that humor is the route to enlightenment, and that play is the essential tool for that.
Yeah.
Irreverence is essential.
Well, that's the word you used, irreverence. What's your favorite new tool? Irreverence.
Irreverence. Exactly.
That is great. It reminded me too of being a community and a wholeness. Monty Python's great line is, guy's talking in front of a big crowd and he says, repeat after me. We are all individuals. And the whole crowd goes, we are all individuals. And one guy yells, not me.
That's what I mean. They're geniuses. Absolutely.
No, that wasn't in the script. That was an extra who just yelled it. And they went, okay, keep that. Now they knew.
Yeah.
Somehow they knew. Give the writing credit to that guy, but they did it in the extras, so we know that now. So, but that was beautiful. Cool. So, let's stay on humor for a second. What's the function of laughter?
Oof, health, regeneration, boost your immune system, everything. I love making people laugh. And, I think it's really, really essential. So I think the function of laughter is health.
That's a great word. Gurdjieff said the function of laughter is the reconciliation of yes and no. So there's a Steve Allen line that McLuhan loved to repeat. Behind every joke, there's a grievance. Any comment?
I don't agree. And again, my father was a humorist. He was a cartoonist, and he never did anything that was mean or, critical. And it always seemed as though, the whole function here was, again, to enlighten in every sense. Right? Yeah. It's to make things lighter. It's to, it's to ease the burden. It's also, humor is very, very present, and and it's also very accurate. Something is only funny if it's true.
Yeah.
Right? It's like fantasy, horror, mystery. They don't have to be true, right? None of those genres have to be true, but you're not going to laugh at a joke unless it really feels like it's, right there, telling you something about, your own experience.
Really good. I'm curious your thoughts, because we grew up with That Was the Week That Was and Mad Magazine.
Yes.
And Harry Shearer's Le Show. And then all of a sudden, Jon Stewart turned in, what was called, they changed the word fake news from comedy news to disinformation. But you got Colbert, and you got a lot of people getting their news from Colbert or whatever. Do you think what's called comedy news now more activates or more pacifies?
Ooh, that's a great question. And I don't know, I read a lot of newspapers. I read about 10 front pages in the morning from around different, French, Irish, American. And, what's so discouraging to me is even the news broadcast, which I like to listen to in the evening, I listen for maybe 40 minutes on television. You would think there wasn't the rest of the world. You wouldn't know that people are starving in Sudan because of the war, that war. You wouldn't know, what's happening with, food crops in Britain. You wouldn't know what was going on with, sort of the troubles that the Copenhagen, stock exchange burned down today. Like none of that shows up. We're so self-obsessed with our local issues. It's like some kind of family pathology. It's just not healthy.
It's amazing. There's an article that suggests that basically Jon Stewart spawned Tucker Carlson because we grew up with Walter Cronkite and we
Yeah.
believed him. We said this is a true source.
Yes.
60 Minutes was investigative journalism. And
Yeah.
then Jon Stewart got so much money to be kind of satire news that Tucker goes, well, I can do that too.
Yeah.
So then it spawned getting a lot of money and a lot of listeners to what you could label as disinformation or news with a bias or whatever. So it's a complex world. And I'm curious your thoughts on you create what you resist. Now, I'm not saying you, but one creates what one resists. Bob Goldthwait, the comedian, morphed it into you are what you hate. And James Joyce said, it's a curious thing how your mind is super saturated with the religion in which you say you disbelieve. Louis Buñuel nailed it. He said, thank God I'm an atheist. So, Johanna, what's your thoughts on this? You create what you resist. One creates what one resists. Any thoughts on that?
Well, we know that if you, this is such basic sort of, Tai Chi, right? It's like if you give your energy to something, you can't leave it, right?
Yeah.
So if you want to be freed from something, you cannot keep giving it attention and energy. So if you want to move on, you've got to let go.
Yeah. It's amazing.
Resistance is a very powerful force. So you can't let go as long as you're resisting. You're caught.
Yeah.
Right? And you want to let go. You've got to walk away. You've got to like disengage. You've got to pull your energy back to yourself.
Yeah. That's like Alan Watts said, everybody's trying to figure out who they are. If you figure out who you are, you're fucked. and I'm curious your thoughts on this one. This is both McLuhan and Krishnamurti said, violence is the human search for identity.
I don't know. I mean, maybe I don't know. I mean, Krishnamurti was a very wise man, but violence feels to me like it's about compensation and power, right?
Yeah.
And so the sense of, is it overcoming inadequacy? Is that what violence is about? Is it, just the desire to conquer and dominate? And where's that come from? Bad upbringing. I mean, it's like, it's hard to sort of attribute Genghis Khan's activity to, his mother. That just doesn't seem quite right.
You just led perfectly into what I want to touch on is are humans hardwired to be violent? And, Maria Gambudis right there at UCLA was kind of saying, no, I've shown you there's cultures that had no violence. And then, Riane Eisler wrote Chalice and the Blade. And then this whole thing of matristic, what caused matriarchy is basically the question.
Yeah. Oh, well, matriarchies, I'm not an anthropologist. I don't feel like I can make an intelligent answer to that. But, what's clear is that in cultures where women can own property and have power, it's often because the men are at risk from some, aspect of their lives that makes them vulnerable, right? So,
yeah.
In Greece, women can own, it's like because the men are gone in these boats and may not come back. I mean, you can't risk, sort of property being unbounded from the family. But
what's the most significant difference between women and men, physical aside?
well, I mean, there's so again, men and women are not two different things. We know the spectrum of gendered identity is quite nuanced, and but it's in my experience, the main difference has been that women really are parallel thinkers, and men have much more difficulty with that, and that does seem to be a physiological wiring issue.
Yeah, that's body related, you mean?
It's body related, but it has consequences.
What's another way of describing parallel thinking?
Well,
Flesh that out a little. What does that mean?
yeah, I mean, I think it's the capacity to, multitask, to process different things all at the same time and at different time scales and frames.
Yeah,
And so women's roles in the domestic sphere had to do with managing, children, animals, pots and pans, things that were cooking, things that were curing, things that were, being attended to all at once. Whereas, the role of the hunter is to be linear, to be directed, to follow that trail to the end, to the resolution. So
yeah.
there are different kind of success strategies, and whether that simply over time reinforced those sort of cognitive strengths and patterns, so that gender became coded into physiology. I don't know.
Well, it's really interesting too, because just blocks from your house, Nina Menkins just put out her film about a year ago called Brainwashed. And I'm not sure if you've seen it or watched the 2-minute trailer at least, but she's basically talking about the male gaze in Hollywood. And, I love to suss this out a little because John Berger was the first one to kind of start using that word, the human gaze.
Mm-hmm.
Like, did we invent the human gaze? So, Alice Guy Blanchet is a female filmmaker who got blackballed out of film history. She was inventing film with Méliès. And did she have I'm just asking these questions, a female gaze, or was she raised just like most of us or people then that men dominated photography and painting? So she learned how to frame from these past males.
Right,
And
right.
did she all of a sudden say, I have the female gaze? I mean, the real kicker here is the famous scene from Potemkin that Eisenstein has with the baby buggy going down the steps. It's spoofed in Woody Allen and all that. She did that scene in a film, and Eisenstein saw it when he was 8 years old. So he basically learned that scene from a woman.
Right.
Now, the baby buggy, and all this. So is there, any thoughts on this? Is there the human gaze? Then there's the female gaze. Then there's the male gaze. There's the biological gaze. Is there, differences in the gaze is basic.
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, I think what you're pointing to is the extent to which cultural conventions become norms, and then we all inhabit them, whether we're, biologically gendered male or female, and then, sort of figuring out how to, what alternatives there are is not self-evident. And this came up for me in a recent discussion of Samuel Beckett's 3 novels, Malloy, Malone Dies, and The Unnameable. And I said, this book felt very gendered to me, not because of its thematics and its self-obsession with, the characters, but because of the permission that Beckett granted himself.
Yeah.
So I do not think a woman writer in mid-century could have given herself that permission, because there would have been no recognition of that as an authoritative stance.
Yeah.
It would have been dismissed as, oh, you wrote a book about nothing, in which nothing happens, right? Like, imagine, Waiting for Godot, written by a woman. It'd be like, well, there's nothing there, right? And that would have always been the self-perception women would have had, is like, I'm going to be found out as an imposter. Even with all of our confidence, it's like, no, I'm not an imposter. I know what I'm doing. I know what I'm up to. But, it's like, what mid-century woman, would have, can you imagine Elizabeth Bowen, or, even like, we could go through a list of interesting women novelists. They wouldn't have gone there.
Yeah.
It's not really till you get, at least I think, people like Kathy Acker or Bernadette Mayer, or, sort of starting to, really push, against, really take hold of an experimental position, that you begin to get women writers who are like, no, I don't have to prove myself within the existing norms. But so gendered issues are so subtle and kind of pernicious and undermining.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Heavy duty. Well, do you feel, I mean, I never asked this question, but I pondered it. How did feminism succeed and how did it fail? Or is it just, it's really not properly worded. What, what, what's your thoughts on feminism? Since it sort of kicked in
yeah.
as this is, yeah.
Well, again, one's attitude towards these things changes over time. I mean, let's start with the fact that we still don't have an equal rights amendment in the United States.
Yeah.
Women do not have equal rights under the law.
Yeah.
And now that we're watching this grotesque and, an absolutely disgusting violation of women's autonomy, through these restrictive abortion laws and increasingly restriction of access to birth control. I
Yeah.
mean, it's insane. So feminism, it's not the fault of feminism that this occurred, but, and then that's in the US. I mean, we could look globally and think about, what's happened with the Taliban, and girls are not even allowed to go. And I say girls deliberately because they're, not yet even at the age of puberty, aren't allowed to go to school. I mean, so for me, feminism, when I first encountered it, was terrifying. I thought if I became a feminist, I would be ugly and not get married, that no one would love me.
Wow.
But, I got ugly and didn't get married anyway. So
Oh, come on, you're beautiful. I love it. But it is, I don't want to, especially I'm a male saying, how did feminism fail?
no, but
my thing is like Boy Genius. I think they're a great new rock group. They all dress like men. And it's like, wait, I kind of get it, but I also like, well, why are you, so, I mean, it's a push and pull. I want,
it took a while. I mean, I have to say, for me, it took a while to come around to it. I remember the, first way, the women's movements and Gloria Steinem and Betty Friedan, and they're older than I am. And I was like, I don't know. I was so determined to be a writer and to be an artist and to be an intellectual. I didn't want to be a woman intellectual or a woman writer.
yes.
And that, I think, is part of what feminism offered was, yes, you didn't have to. But when my friends were wanting to publish in Ms. magazine, I thought, no, I don't want to go there. It's like, so, feminism did so much to, provide legal and economic and, sexual, possibilities. Remember that feminism, for the feminism we're talking about, also comes about with the pill. I mean, so sexual, freedom and so forth. But again, it's, everybody thought, I remember, I think it was Demi Moore played, it's like, if we thought that feminism was going to change governments because women were going to get into power and rule completely differently, that was delusional. Maggie Thatcher. Like, again, we need Monty Python, It's like,
And I have to,
Hatchet Thatcher.
yeah, that's funny because I have to add, I mean, Chrissy Hines is like a female rock star, but in her book, she said, I dressed up sexy in this biker group. Bikers raped me and I deserved it because I dressed up too sexy. Now that's a heavy thing for her to say. And I appreciate she's being honest, but it's like, that's like, wow, you get this, again, you get all ends of the spectrum.
Nobody ever deserves to be raped.
Exactly.
I'm sorry. Like that is just a completely, there's nobody ever deserves to be raped.
Right. And believe me, I might not have quoted her book exactly, but she brought up this idea that it could have helped cause or whatever she said. So We got about 15 more minutes. It's really been fun. Here's a couple more and we're out of here.
Okay.
How do you find peace of mind?
Petting my cats, my angels. How else? And pulling weeds. Those are my favorite things to do.
Oh my God, it fits right into our discussion. We have cleared 3 trees out in front of our window there, and we have this whole area that's just growing new. And these big dandelions grew up, and they're weeds to
Yep.
some people. But A. Milne said, weeds are flowers once you get to know them.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And we're just like rejoicing. This is a flower. It's beautiful. Why call it a weed? And these are 5 Alan Watts questions, just
Oh,
off
okay.
the top of your head in a couple words. 1, who started it all?
No answer there. Monty
Are
Python.
2, are we going to make it?
The human species is not going to make it. No.
3, where do we put it?
I think that I can't answer that in a public forum.
4, who's cleaning it up?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's where it ends up being the women.
And 5, is it serious?
You know, it's only as serious as you make it.
Yeah.
It's certain things are so basic for human beings within the limited frameworks of our awareness and consciousness and our mortal, sort of existences. I think some things are so fundamental that it's worth keeping them in mind. And one of those, which I try to, again, share with my younger friends in particular, is simply, you never get a day back.
Yeah.
You never get a day back.
Yeah.
So whatever it is that's going on for you in that day, it's the only time you get that day. So, treasure it. It's precious.
So agreed. Thank you. If you were walking down the street today and you met yourself as a 12-year-old, what would you say to your 12-year-old self?
I'd say absolutely go for it. I know that little 12-year-old self. I've been working a bunch with the manuscripts I wrote when I was 12. And so it's like my aspirations at the age of 12 have got me where I am. And I still feel that I owe that little 12-year-old one more big push to, get things into the world that she wanted to have in the world. And I'm going to see if I can do that.
Which way should toilet paper come off the roll, over or under?
Over. Everybody knows that.
The patent has it going over, but they're 80 to 90% say over, but the ones who say under have their reasons. If a publisher was to release your autobiography off the top of your head, what would the title be?
Oh, Graphomaniac.
Oh, that is good. And they want to scent the glue in the binding. What smell?
I would go for some nice, floral. I don't know, off the top of my head. Lilac. Lilac's nice.
Lilac is beautiful. I love that.
Jasmine is excellent.
Jasmine.
Right now, the jasmine is blooming in our neighborhood. And let's have jasmine instead of lilac.
Okay. If a statue is built in your honor, where would you want it displayed and what would it be made of?
It's an interesting idea. Well, I guess I do have an attachment to that little 12-year-old. And, so somehow a schoolyard where there are children playing and, so that they could imagine, a kind of version of themselves, future version of themselves, fulfilling what they imagine they could become. That would be great. So to do that, I'm afraid it would, I sort of like the idea of having it made of ice so that it melts.
I like that. It really reminded me of when I speak to students sometimes as they're walking in, I'll say, well, what are you aspiring to be or do, to get an idea what their career plan is. they'll go 3D animator, editor, filmmaker, director. And this woman once said, a good human being.
Oh, that's very
And
sweet.
I was like, and then the next woman said, a role model, because she came from a small town
Yeah.
and she wanted to be a role model for the students who would follow her from her small town.
But I think this is so true. I mean, when I think about my own life as a teacher, it wasn't the subject matter I was communicating to them. I mean, that was there, but it was an enthusiasm, an absolute enthusiasm that there are more amazing things to know and to learn in this world than you will have time for in your life. And it's just, just inexhaustible.
You got a great attitude. Tell me something good you never had and you never want.
Something good I never had, never want. Oh, I guess, an extended family could have been quite wonderful. I never had it, and not really. And, it comes with its liabilities.
Yes. What's the cultural shift you see developing today that inspires you?
Ooh. I'm afraid the cultural shifts I see are not inspiring. I mean, the shift to corporate fascism, rising fascism, pseudo-populism that's really a front for corporate fascism, the transfer of wealth, all of those things are just grotesque. So the one thing that feels like a counter to that is the sort of youth commitment to ecological sanity.
It's good. Ecological sanity. I want that. What's a question that remains unresolved for you?
Poof. Yeah, I don't know. There's always the question of, will anything that you aspire to actually come to be?
Yeah.
I've done a lot of stuff in my life, and a lot of people would say it's enough. But I feel like, no, I'm just getting going.
How has making art, teaching shaped your behavior?
I guess I loved teaching because, again, of the, you model behavior, you empower people, you inspire them to, see possibilities for themselves that they don't see. And that was always really great. And, making art is that. It's like, when I think about things I did when I was in my 20s and that I had this kind of chutzpah to like go and I'm just going to do this and do it, and it's sort of like call up the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam and say, I just printed this book and I think you should see it. And I take it to them and they hold on to it for a week and then they say they're going to buy it. Like, where did I get the whatever to do that? Right. And, so yeah. Go for it.
Go for it. Beautiful. Thornton Wilder said, art is confession. Art is the secret told. But art is not only the desire to tell one's secret, it's the desire to tell it and hide it at the same time.
Yeah.
You've laid your cards on the table for over 3 hours, Johanna. I'm not implying that you haven't already answered this. What's it really all about for you?
Well, I think I already said it earlier, which is, to me, the whole purpose of art was to, make experience into form so that I could understand how to have experience.
Yeah.
And the best art, when you see it in a museum, I'll never forget the first time I went to a Dwayne Hansen exhibit.
Yeah.
And I left that exhibit and everybody I encountered on the street, in the subways, in a restaurant for hours afterward looked just like a Dwayne Hansen sculpture. And I thought, that is what art does. It gives you a way to see the world, right? It's like my experience was transformed because I had had this offered to me as a way of seeing and understanding. So to me, it's, making experience into form so that I can understand how to have experience.
Yeah. so well put. It reminds me of Richard Modiani taught me that Gary Snyder said. I said it in part one, but it is Gary said the task of the poet is to see the world without language, then put that seeing into language.
Well,
Sort of like seeing with new eyes.
yeah. No, I think that that's one mode of poetic production. I mean, another is to see, going back to the things we've been talking about in terms of norms and social conventions and the way they blind us to possibilities. You know, another sort of role for art is to expose those conventions in order to allow them to be surpassed.
Yeah. Yeah. Expose the conventions. That's again back to Yvonne Rainer saying, after Audre Lorde said, nor to dismantle the master's house, you've got to use the master's tools. And Yvonne Rainer says, no, you can do it by exposing the tools.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know?
I don't think there's any one formula, you know, and again, the great thing about art is, you know, there are no rules.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, you can work within certain parameters, you can work within certain kinds of conventions and so forth, but, you know, aesthetic territory exists to be invented.
Yeah.
It's not finite. We're not fighting over it.
So good. So well put. My friend who's been making art in the streets of Venice for 50 years, his line is, art isn't. We already know art is, but it also art isn't. It's also like he says, Thelonious Monk heard all the same notes Charlie Parker heard, but only decided to play some of them.
Yes, yes.
So it's sort of like, how do you become discerning? You know, like everybody and their mother's a Duchamp clone. I mean, once Duchamp hit, I've never seen anyone do anything different than Duchamp. Sorry. People go, oh, Warhol. I said, well, I love Warhol, but I'm sorry, he's, you know, blah, blah, blah. So,
yeah.
So what gives you the most optimism?
I don't know, you know, I mean, well, I do know, actually. It's the regenerative capacity of the natural world.
Yeah.
The world doesn't need us. And, you know, all kinds of life forms will emerge, evolve, and, you know, come into being in our wake.
But is that biomimicry? We can see that happening. So we're going to stress and try to do that.
Well, you know, we're doomed. I mean, the human species is not going to make it. I mean, we haven't even been around very long. You know, Homo sapiens haven't even been around as long as Neanderthals. Neanderthals were around 400,000 years. We've only been around, modern humans have been around 200,000 years. And boy, have we managed to extract a lot of value from the earth and turn it into junk. And, you know, so...
Yeah, I used to ask, is human progress cyclical or cumulative?
It's terminal.
It's terminal, yeah. I said it's sort of like a cone. Sometimes we're circling up and sometimes we're circling down.
Yeah, it's not looking too good. You know? So...
Well, the first question I asked is, what's the best thing for a human being? And Wilhelm Reich said the best thing for a human being is another human being. They asked Groucho Marx at the end of his life, the last question, what gives you the most optimism? And he said, other people. Oh. So it's sure been fun spending this time with another person, especially because it was you. Thank you so much, Johanna.
You are so dear. Jared, thank you so much. This has been absolutely an honor and a pleasure. And everybody you quote is somebody that I love.
Yeah. Well, you taught me a lot and you continue to teach me a lot. So even though I'm going to hit the end broadcast button, I hope this never ends and we can keep talking forever and ever.
Thank you. And I hope to encounter you in some actual circumstance at some point. We're so close as neighbors. So.
We will. I'll send you my list. We got a whole bunch of great events coming up at Beyond Broke and all over town.
Good. Yeah. I'm there regularly. So good. Okay. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you
So much.